Good morning, everybody. Again, I'm Goldie Bird. I direct the Maya Angelou Center for Health Equity at Wake Forest University School of Medicine. In the Innovation Quarter, which is what you see on the screen, and this is the institution, Dr. Ballsbury and Carey, that is known for eugenics in North Carolina. So, and I start my talk with that because, as we've already mentioned, these are some of the kinds of hurdles we have to jump over in order to invest in time, energy, and money into communities that have been disproportionately burdened by these scientific and medical atrocities. I want to thank Mark for the invitation today and all of you for being here. It's quite nice being in anything that has Paul Robeson tied to it. Paul Robeson was certainly a champion for justice for people, so it's quite appropriate for me to be here talking about justice in Alzheimer's genetics. I'm also happy to see all of the different levels of trainees here today. I've talked to undergrads, grads, postdocs, clinical coordinators and scientists, as well as folks who are just interested participants, and these are some of the most important people we actually need to talk to. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about Alzheimer's, genetic susceptibility of Alzheimer's, if I can get this to move, and then a little bit about why study genetics and why study genetics in African Americans. Then I'll talk a little bit about global and local ancestry, and then about just a tiny bit about inclusion. So if you really want to know a lot about what we're doing with regard to inclusion, I will be giving a plenary at the AAIC, so it's on the last day, so you guys have to stay to listen to it. So as we look at Alzheimer's disease around the globe, you can see that everywhere you look, it is increasing, and so it's all the more important. And as we think about this disease and think about the importance of understanding it ahead of time, as we say, about 15 or 20 years before we begin to see symptoms, this is a disease that is wreaking havoc on everybody, but mostly on people who have been burdened by certain atrocities in life and in society and conditions, past and present, that have exacerbated their burden of disease. So you've basically seen this before. Dr. Ballsbury talked about population growth and where in the United States these places are most burdened by disease. So if we look at why we study Alzheimer's genetics, so we look at the basic human genome and go from there to drug targets, this is an area that has so much potential when it comes to drug targets. And so it's been very, very important that we understand what the genetic architecture is across populations and across ancestries, as opposed to race, as Dr. Ballsbury has already talked about. So again, we do this work to identify new targets for drug discovery, and so we know that this is critical because genetic targets are twice more likely to be successful in drug trials versus non-genetic targets. That's enough right there to say you need to study genetics, right? And so we also have to assure that we're not limited to race and ethnicity, as Dr. Ballsbury has already told you. That we have different ancestral groups that have different genetic risk factors, and so the treatments must be universal. So everybody should be able to. I can tell you, if I had Alzheimer's today, and I might, but if I had it, I would not want to be left out of a treatment opportunity, or a loved one without a treatment opportunity just because of the way I look, or the way somebody has said I could be separated or cast aside. So I'm having a difficult time seeing this. Okay. So about 30 years ago, Margaret Pearcheck Vance and a team of individuals discovered this ApoE4 allele as it relates to Alzheimer's disease. And about 20 years ago, I actually went on sabbatical at Duke and started working with her and told her in no uncertain terms that I wanted to do a Genomewide association study. It was right around the time the Human Genome Project was being released. And I knew that was going to make a tremendous impact on science and medicine. And I was at that time working at an HBCU, and I wanted my students to know more about the Human Genome Project. So we began working then around, and I remember distinctly talking to her about that GWAS, and she said to me, well, you know, this is something I've been wanting to do, but I can't get those black people in my study, and I can put a sign up in the elevator and do all the work I need to do in genetics, but I can't get blacks in. So we had an uphill battle for initially, but she said yes, because she said, this is something I wanted to do, and that's all, quite frankly, I needed to hear her say. So we began working with the NIH and working with colleagues in different sites to figure out how we could begin to introduce genetics to the African American community and how we could be authentic and really supportive of communities who understood this was needed, but how could they actually get involved in that? And so I'm not going to... With a connection. Please try again later. So anyway... as we know, we have these 23 pairs of chromosomes and that we call our human genome. So since that time, there's been quite a bit of work in human genomics, human genetics, human genomics, and we know that these three genes, APP, PS1, PS2, presenilin 1 and 2, are genes that we say are highly penetrant. That means that if you have these genes, you have a high chance of getting the disease. And so we know that we also, but those are individuals who are actually, it have what we call early onset Alzheimer's disease. So early onset or Alzheimer's disease are people who actually have the disease in midlife and younger. I think the earliest that we've probably seen is about 27. And then there's the sporadic late onset Alzheimer's disease, which is much more complex, which we don't have genes that are truly determinant or truly penetrant, but there are a number of genes that are associated with Alzheimer's disease. So if you look at ApoE4, as we've already found out, is that this is the most impactful gene, but it does act differently among different populations with different ancestral backgrounds. So I'll just skip that one for the time being. So then why do we study Alzheimer's disease in African Americans? And again, we have greater familial risk, limited health care access. AD patients are typically identified at later stages, and I think the Alzheimer's Association says about 40% of the time people who actually have it will not be told that they have it. And then poor treatment outcomes. And then in general, just those social drivers of health that we've been talking about that we now are getting into as well are certainly influencing the prevalence and incidence of Alzheimer's disease. And then there was NAPA, the National Alzheimer's Project Act, signed into legislation by President Obama, and just mandating that we do a better job. And there were specific research goals around treating and raising awareness and making sure that all populations are involved. I believe that was just a few years ago. So we've been talking about ApoE4. Again, it's the most impactful gene and profound on chromosome 19. And what we find is that the risk, as Dr. Gunya talked about earlier, is very different among different people, groups of people with different ancestral backgrounds. So that risk then is something that we cannot just generalize from, well, what we know about Alzheimer's genetics is mostly in Europeans and white folks. And so what we know for sure, one of the things I want you to leave with today is that we cannot continue to translate what we know about one population and make that work for all populations. And so when we talk about Alzheimer's genetics, and we talk about biomarkers, and we talk about any other phase of Alzheimer's research, diversity and inclusion are absolutely paramount. So then, again, why do we study African Americans and other diverse groups? If we look at these ancestrally diverse populations, you can see that, again, most of this is some work that was done to show how many people actually, how many individuals, and actually this paper shows how many studies as well, and it's just as dismal, that is just as dismal as looking at how many people are actually involved across these populations. And you can see that African Americans, where African Americans fall, is really quite dismal. And this is something that came from the Alzheimer's Association. The Alzheimer's Association's Facts and Figures looks at the percentage of adults who believe medical research is biased against people of color. So as we begin to think about how to close some of those barriers in genetics or in whatever study we're doing, we can see people's perceptions, and we actually have done quite a bit of work in people's perceptions about participation. And then those who trust that an Alzheimer's cure will be shared equally, regardless of race, color, or ethnicity. And so you can see that blacks have the lowest percentage there. So then the ADSP, Alzheimer's Disease Sequencing Project, which looks to sequence all of the genome. Now, the Human Genome Project did a tremendous amount, and we know that those people who were involved in that sequencing project were not as diverse as we would like for it to be, and neither is the Alzheimer's Disease Sequencing Project. So to find out what is going on genetically, we look to sequence the entire genome, and we look to see which of those sequences are most associated with a disease like Alzheimer's disease. And when we say DNA sequencing, we look to see the pattern of bases, the pattern of the sequence of our DNA, because it's that sequence that determines what the gene does. So if it's different between a person who has Alzheimer's, say, and a person who does not, we need to detect that, because then the protein, which is one of the outcomes of that, will make a difference in terms of whether or not a person is more susceptible. And so there are many advances in terms of Alzheimer's genetics, or in terms of genetics in general. Again, the Human Genome sequence at the Human Genome Project in 2003, the International Health Map Project. They're just, and I don't necessarily want you to worry about these right now, except to say that there have been huge, really large advances from the National Institutes of Health and the federal government, and then across sites around the globe that have come together to try to figure out the genetics of Alzheimer's disease. One of the things, the last one here, the third one there in the orange, is the Genomewide Association Study, which is a major advancement to help us understand where genes are that are associated with Alzheimer's disease. And that's been one of the big ones that help us understand across those 23 pairs of chromosomes, we can identify about where Alzheimer's loci exist. And so let me just share, and Dr. Gunya brought up a Manhattan plot, and for those people from New York, it's called Manhattan because it sort of looks like the Manhattan skyline. But the Genomewide Association study that I mentioned earlier can actually take individuals who have the disease and compare those individuals in terms of genes associated with the disease. Just compare those two and come up with where these genes are. That's actually how ApoE was found. So again, we created these strong collaborations about 20 years ago, and this was actually when they found ApoE about 30 years ago. And it was just a really, really small amount of money, but thank goodness the NIH, we're just talking about how NIH now is beginning to put a lot more money over the past few years in this. I'm going to skip a couple of these because I do want to have a little bit of time to answer some questions. So I'm going to skip a couple of these and talk a little bit about Ancestry and ApoE. one of the things that we know for sure is that we must study Africa. We must study our African ancestry. What we're finding is that they're different based on an African or even we've done work with the Caribbean Hispanics based upon that background, ApoE differently. And so again, that's the most impactful gene, but it's different in those backgrounds. So it's not enough to talk about race and ethnicity. Again, race is biological. Race is not a biological construct. It's something we created. And so when we say we're going to get self-identified Black people or self-identified any other kind of race, it's certainly not sufficient for, I'm going to move quickly, just going to skip a couple of these. And so if you look at local ancestry, so we have to think about two different types of ancestry. Local ancestry means that particular gene, but global ancestry, we have to think about populations of people who were more homogeneous before we began to migrate through to other populations, so as in enslavement. And so when we do that, when we look at local ancestry, we're talking about the architecture of a gene or just a block of genes. And so we are able to do that based upon our admixture. Admixture simply means how we are mixed up. So if we say we're African American and we think that's a kind of person, we need to know how much of it is Black, how much of it is African, how much of it is Caribbean, et cetera. So we're able to do that, and that's that's another major accomplishment. And so if you see, you can look at ancestry versus race here. You can see that there may be very little of Africa in you. There may be a big part. And genes are different. They express differently depending upon your ancestral background. Let's see. So again, ancestry versus race. Ancestry is biological. Race is not. And as I've shown, populations used to live in isolation with these geographic region having its own genetic map. Continental populations, those are global, but we are very much in need of looking at our global as well as our local ancestry. This is why we really have to study. If you look at this, the largest Genomewide Association studies have about 95,000 people, and Kunkel is a member of our team as well. But if you look at African Americans, the largest Genomewide Association study has about 8,000 people. That is the largest. So we are looking to really make a difference. And of course, Hispanics a little bit less, a little bit more now since 2015. And as Maya Angelou says, diversity makes for a rich tapestry. We must understand that all the threads of the tapestry are equal in value, no matter what their color. In other words, no matter what their race. So this is, I'm gonna just skip that one. Just to say that one of the things that we have done recently, last year we received funding for this project, recruitment and retention of AD diversity genetic cohorts in ADSP, and Dr. Genya is a part of this, and so we're really excited about doing this work. We're going to recruit 13,000 people in this study, and these are in America as well as in 9 countries in Africa. So we're really excited about that, and then we have folks who will be doing the social determinants as well. We'll be looking at the genetic architecture, some biomarker work. So we're really excited about that piece of work. And I just want to thank and acknowledge people who've been very, very helpful. When I was at North Carolina A&T State University, we developed an outreach center to assist us in going into community and making sure we were being honest and authentic about Alzheimer's and about research participation. And this is one of the things, Carey, that we left in the community. We created a center for the sole purpose of aging research and educating people, not recruiting, but of educating people and leaving opportunities for people to learn more about the disease, how to get resources, and how to connect with research if they chose to do so. I think that's it.
We have time for a question. Yeah, come on. Why don't you introduce yourself? I know who you are.
My name is Ben Bacon. I've been with the study for about 4 or 5 years. And I may have missed the the explanation, but I keep on seeing APOE. Could you
Yes.
explain what that means?
Yes. So APOE is a lipid is a gene that is most associated with this. We know more about that gene than any other gene with regard to Alzheimer's disease. It has three forms to it. It has an ApoE2, an ApoE3, and an ApoE4. We call them alleles, but they have two, three, and four. Sorry, 2, 3, and 4. The ApoE4, one form of that gene is really involved in Alzheimer's disease among populations. It is more involved with non-Black people. It has a different way of behaving in Black people. So the different forms are associated with different things. So the ApoE2 is more protective, we believe. The ApoE3 has not much impact. The ApoE4 form of that is the one you'll see most studied. It's the most studied. It's the most impactful. It has the most association. But in Blacks and in Yorubans, it is not as impactful as it is in white. Another reason we study genes, because they don't act the same across populations, but it's involved in lipid transport. All the more reason we need to keep those lipids and cholesterols and all those things together.
Thanks, Benjamin. Benjamin, as you've gathered, is one of our longtime participants in our NIH Pathways study.
Great.
We'll take one more question.
Carey calls them volunteers.
Two more.
I like
That's a
that.
student. We always speak
Yes.
student questions. So.
Great.
I did the video.
Yes.
From University University.
Yes.
And I put that
You have to speak louder.
I'm from Georgia State University, and my project explores the relationship between obesity and Alzheimer's. My question was specifically on the Human Genome Project.
Yes.
I wanted to know if there's current data on the human genome regards specifically populations in Africa.
I don't think we have anything from the Human Genome Project. It was a highly selective group of people that were selected to participate in it, and I don't think Africa was included, if I remember correctly.
Why don't we just squeeze it out? I always want students that you should introduce yourself. And by the way, both of these two are two of our 10 travel fellowship student
Oh, great.
awardees. So you can learn more about their work.
Yes.
Both of them have posters that you'll be able to see when we finish up the rep. We'll move over to the other side at 4:45. So.
And interestingly, as we talk about African ancestry with regard to African American genetics, it's more variants are going to be found in Africa than there are in the United States. And so it all the more important that we collaborate with Africa. Can you imagine doing Alzheimer's genetics in Blacks without doing it in Africa? It's not even imaginable. So,
You can speak louder. We don't like.
Thank you. I think my name is Chinese. Regarding students at the University of Wisconsin.
yes.
My question is to the Project. Are there any specific genes that have been identified of interest that either increase or reduce the risk of Alzheimer's?
Oh, yes. Yes, and I'm sorry that I didn't say how many with the Manhattan plot, but there are over 70 loci that have been associated, and we say loci because some of them are genes and then some of them are functional elements in genetics. So our team actually looked at a 40 base pair deletion in ABCA7. So they're not only genes, but they're also functional elements that are associated with. There are over 70 of them.
Okay, thank you all so much.